Hi folks, Dr. P here, and for the third time I'm going to get away from games a little to talk about the Russian-Ukraine war, and particularly about direct and indirect methods as used in Ukraine. Now, I've talked about direct and indirect methods at length in other places. The very brief definition is direct methods you strike at the enemy's strength and defeat them. You seek battle. You rely on greater strength. And indirect methods, you avoid fighting except when necessary or when the enemy is at a great disadvantage. And you can think of the United States as a country that tended to use direct methods and rely on air power and artillery and so on in order to defeat the enemy in World War II. Now, I don't have any special sources for what's going on in the Ukraine war, and I can't say that I've tried to find out exactly how the fighting works, but what I do know may reveal quite a bit. So what were the stages of the conflict? Early in the war, the Russians attempted to use direct methods, just go down the roads and push whatever opposed them out of the way, or even drop onto the airfields and then just take over from there. But they found that MANPADs, that is man-portable anti-tank systems, and Stingers, which are old but effective anti-air missiles that are short range, made this impractical. And that was partly because of their own logistical incompetence and sheer overconfidence. So the Ukrainians managed to stop them, and we ended up with a stalemate. The Russians pulled all their forces away from Kiev, which at the time I thought was kind of a bad idea since they'd captured so much, but they did. And now the fluidity in the battles is on the Ukrainian side versus rigidity on the Russian side. And this will only get worse as they have untrained, mobilized people coming into the units. And Ukraine, of course, has great success at attacking Russian logistics, which makes it even tougher. Now, Russia had and perhaps still has the upper hand by far in Ukraine in terms of offensive missiles, in aircraft, and in artillery, at least in the numbers of artillery systems. Though they've lost more jets and helicopters than the Ukrainians ever had, and they've given the Ukrainians more weapons by leaving them behind when the Russians retreated than the Ukrainians had to start with. Of course, Russian military history shows a reliance on outnumbering the enemy and on using large masses of artillery, both very direct ways of doing things. Somehow, Ukraine has avoided both tendencies, maybe thanks to Western training or thanks to knowing they would be outnumbered and those methods would not be practical. So we have something that reminds sometimes of trench warfare. But it's not really, it's just a lot of digging in because Ukraine is very flat and open except for the waterways and lakes, and there seem to be a lot of waterways and lakes. This makes settlements the best defensive terrain available unless you have a pretty wide body of water, of course. Otherwise, you can hide in the tree lines or in the occasional forests. But mostly you dig World War I style trenches with dugouts. Now, in a wide open thing like that, you'd think that tanks would dominate, but again, the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons and the precision artillery that the Ukrainians are able to use have more or less neutered armored vehicles. And of course, we have to keep in mind that the armored vehicles that are being used are by and large very old. Drones provide reconnaissance, especially for the Ukrainian artillery, and the Ukrainian artillery, at least what's been given to them by the West, is so accurate that a drone can call in artillery fire and often the first shot hits the vehicle that they want to destroy. Very surprisingly, manned aircraft have little influence because it's so dangerous between the man-portable anti-air systems like the Stinger and others, and the anti-aircraft missiles that are common, S-300s, S-400s, and so on. It's dangerous for manned aircraft to fly in most of the combat area. And if they do, there's a good chance they'll be shot down. Now, the Ukrainians have introduced something that when the USA had troops in Somaliland, the natives called technicals. They mounted a machine gun on a vehicle such as a pickup truck or a Jeep. It was much faster than an armored vehicle, used a lot less gas, and was good for flat terrain. The Ukrainians are using the same thing, machine guns mounted on Humvees and similar military vehicles, and even pickup trucks, and I've even seen pictures of sand buggies, although I'm not sure they had a machine gun mounted on the sand buggy. But these are all fast vehicles that, when the open ground is not muddy, can go fast and go where you wouldn't particularly want to send your armored vehicles. So the Russian military is very hierarchical, what you might call a stiff organization. Their NCOs are not leaders in any sense. They rely on officers, lieutenants and up, to tell them what to do. And otherwise they have little initiative. And that's the way the Russians do things. That's the way they've done things for many decades. And they seem to be very stuck in that method. So when the Russians set up defenses in settlements, they don't necessarily cover the terrain between the settlements as well. And of course they have supply lines that depend heavily on railroads, and they don't have a lot of trucks. So they've got to set up keeping in mind how they're going to get their supplies, perhaps more than the Ukrainians do. Now, when the Ukrainians are scouting by land, and sometimes even in attacks that are meant to displace the Russians, they tend to flow around the strong points in their technicals and keep on going for better positions and to cut supply lines. They're using more or less an indirect method, where the Russians are hoping that the Ukrainians will use a direct method. Ukraine uses, as I've read, 4-person squads for scouting. The same would be a leadership problem for Russia because their weakness of their NCOs. The Russian attacks are direct when they do attack, which evidently has resulted in much higher casualties for them than for Ukraine, both in troops and equipment. And even the Wagner group, mercenaries, who are their best troops evidently, have stalled in front of Bakhmut for months. And some people say, well, you know, they've lost about the same amount on either side. Well, there's no way to be sure, but I remember seeing on one video a document, and it could have been a made-up document, that was supposed to be from the part of the Russian government that pays death benefits to widows of soldiers who've been killed. And the number on that document was nearly 50,000, and this is a month ago at least, if not 2 months. And that doesn't include the LPR and DPR troops who aren't going to be getting paid death benefits from Russia, or at least were not until perhaps they've been annexed. Now they should get paid the death benefits. So it might actually be true that the Russians have had 50 to 60,000 killed, plus a normal amount of wounded aside, and the Ukrainians might have lost by now 10,000. Now, how do you translate this into games? Well, I'm not sure. What has happened is so clear-cut in the end, I'm not sure how I'd turn any of it into a game. And much of the influence on the war is at a grand strategic level, such as the Western's arms shipments and the Russian purchase of Iranian drones. Now, mud season will probably curtail the indirect methods, because in mud season, which comes before and after the dead of winter, it's very difficult to travel off the roads because it's so muddy. But in the dead of winter, that will solidify, and then the Ukrainians may be able to make hay. Who knows? We'll find out, I suppose. Thanks for listening.